October 25th, 1944. The skies above the Philippines were a battlefield. Above, the endless blue American and Japanese aircraft soared, their engines roaring as they prepared for a decisive engagement. For the Japanese pilots, it was a day like many others, an opportunity to defend their homeland and preserve the honor of the Imperial Navy. The Zeros, their legendary fighters, were ready to meet the American planes head-on, as they had done countless times before. But today, something was different. The Zeros, once unmatched in speed and agility, were no longer the kings of the sky. As the American aircraft appeared on the horizon, pounding the air with their raw power, Japanese pilots began to realize that their once dominant machines were struggling to keep up. The American planes, faster, better armed, and more maneuverable than the Zeros, cut through the sky with deadly precision. The Japanese pilots, skilled and experienced, were left in shock as they witnessed a new chapter in aerial combat unfold before them. The Zeros, which had once dominated the Pacific skies, were now being outpaced and outclassed by the very enemies they had sought to defeat. In this moment, the battle for the skies above the Philippines was not just a fight for victory. It was a battle for survival. The Pacific theater of World War II had been defined by a relentless struggle for dominance in the skies. After the Iuatpipiu attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan quickly established itself as the supreme air power in the Pacific. With its formidable fleet of aircraft and highly skilled pilots, the Mitsubishi A6M-0, a carrier-based fighter, was at the heart of this dominance. Renowned for its speed, agility, and range, the Zero quickly earned a reputation as the most lethal fighter in the world. Throughout the early years of the EVI War, the Japanese dominated the skies over the Pacific, crippling the Allied air forces and maintaining air superiority in key battles such as the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Battle of Midway. However, as the war progressed, the tides began to turn. The Americans, having regrouped after the early setbacks, began to innovate and improve their own aircraft. The introduction of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat in 1943 marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of aerial combat. The Hellcat, while not as nimble as the Zero, was significantly more durable, better armed, and capable of inflicting massive damage. The American pilots, equipped with new aircraft and fresh strategies, were beginning to challenge Japanese air superiority. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 and the subsequent battles in the Pacific Islands were pivotal moments in this shift. The United States had already begun a strategic island-hopping campaign, cutting off Japanese supply lines and systematically liberating key islands. With the Americans advancing on the Philippines, the Japanese air forces found themselves stretched thin, their resources dwindling as the U.S. Navy and Air Force steadily grew stronger. By October 1944, the Japanese Imperial Navy had been forced to adapt to the changing conditions. Their once feared Zeros were now facing increasingly formidable American fighters, including the Hellcat and the faster, more powerful F-4U Corsair. While the Zeros remained highly maneuverable and still formidable in dogfights, they lacked the firepower and durability of their American counterparts. Moreover, as the war dragged on, the Japanese experienced mounting challenges in maintaining their aircraft and pilot training programs, as fuel shortages and constant air raids took a heavy toll on their resources. The Philippines, a key strategic location for both the United States and Japan, became the focal point of the next major air confrontation. In preparation for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Japan's remaining aircraft and pilots were called upon to defend their position. It was here, in the skies over the Philippines, that Japanese pilots would experience a shocking realization. Their once untouchable Zeros, which had dominated the Pacific skies for years, were no longer capable of keeping up with the new American aircraft and tactics. The American aircraft, equipped with greater firepower, improved speed, and better maneuverability, quickly proved that they had outclassed the Zeros in nearly every respect. The aerial combat over the Philippines became a brutal demonstration of how the technological and tactical advancements of the Allies were now overwhelming the Japanese forces. The once proud Zero was increasingly unable to compete with the power and precision of its American counterparts, leaving Japanese pilots in disbelief at the sudden and shocking shift in air superiority. As the American forces pressed on, the Zeros were no longer the symbol of Japanese might in the sky. Instead, they had become relics of an earlier time, a time when they had dominated their enemies. The battle in the Philippines was not just a tactical defeat for the Japanese, but also a psychological blow to the Japanese pilots who had once believed in the superiority of their machines. For the Japanese pilots flying the Zero in October 1944, the battle for the skies over the Philippines was unlike anything they had experienced before. The Zero had once been their pride, unmatched in speed, agility, and the ability to outmaneuver enemy fighters in a dogfight. For years, it had been a symbol of Japan's air superiority in the Pacific, enabling them to secure victory after victory. But now, as American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair appeared on the horizon, those same pilots found themselves caught in a situation they had never imagined. The first shock for the Japanese pilots was the sheer power and firepower of the American aircraft. The Hellcats and Corsairs were faster, better armed, and more durable than the Zeros. The American planes, though not as agile in a tight dogfight, had a level of survivability and attacking power that the Zeros simply couldn't match. The Japanese pilots, trained to rely on the exceptional maneuverability of their planes, soon realized that speed and agility were no longer enough to hold their own against the American fighters. What had once been a one-sided contest, where the Zeros could outfly and outfight any opposition, was now a battle of attrition, with the American planes proving superior in nearly every engagement. The psychological shock for the Japanese pilots was palpable. The Zeros, which had been the pride of the Japanese Air Force, were now being outperformed by the very enemy they had long considered inferior. For many pilots, the realization that their planes could no longer compete was a devastating blow. Some pilots had spent their entire careers mastering the intricacies of the Zero, believing in its superiority. To suddenly find themselves facing American aircraft that were faster, more resilient, and better armed was a harsh awakening to the reality of the war's shifting balance. As the battle raged on, the Japanese pilots were forced to adapt quickly. In some cases, they tried to rely on their superior maneuvering skills to gain the upper hand. But even this tactic proved insufficient against the relentless onslaught of the American planes. The skillful dogfights that had once been the hallmark of aerial combat now seemed futile in the face of an enemy that was simply more powerful. In addition to the shock of being outclassed, many Japanese pilots also struggled with the loss of their comrades. As the battle wore on, the toll on the Japanese Air Force was devastating. The Zeros were being shot down in greater numbers, and the pilots, who had once been confident in their machines, found themselves facing the reality that their chances of survival were dwindling. This sense of loss and defeat was compounded by the growing realization that the war was coming to an end, and that Japan's chances of victory were slipping away. The battle for air superiority over the Philippines in October 1944 was a defining moment in the Pacific War, as it demonstrated the evolving nature of aerial combat. The Japanese Zeros, which had once been the undisputed champions of the sky, were now facing a new breed of American aircraft that had been designed specifically to counter their advantages. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, was the most successful American carrier-based fighter of World War II. Built to replace the F-4F Wildcat, the Hellcat was faster, better armed, and more resilient than its predecessor. Its .650 caliber machine guns and the ability to carry bombs or rockets made it a versatile platform in both dogfights and ground attacks. While the Hellcat was not as nimble as the Zero in tight turns, its durability and firepower made it a formidable opponent in the Pacific theater. The F-4U Corsair, another American fighter that made its mark during the war, was even faster and more heavily armed than the Hellcat. The Corsair was equipped with an .850 caliber machine gun and had a greater range than the Zero, making it especially useful for long-range engagements. The Corsair's design allowed it to absorb more damage than the Zero and keep fighting, a quality that the Japanese planes lacked. Together, the Hellcat and Corsair represented a leap forward in American air superiority, as they combined speed, firepower, and durability in ways that the Zeros simply could not match. The Zeros, though still agile and capable of performing well in a dogfight, were increasingly outclassed by the American fighters. In combat, the Zeros' primary advantage had been their superior maneuverability, allowing them to outturn and outmaneuver slower enemy planes. However, by 1944, the American pilots were well trained in tactics that nullified the Zero's advantage. The American planes had better performance in sustained aerial engagements, could take more damage, and, crucially, were faster and more heavily armed. The Zero's lack of armor, combined with its relatively light armament compared to the American fighters, left it vulnerable to the better-equipped Allied planes. Another tactical shift that greatly affected the battle over the Philippines was the strategic use of radar and superior intelligence by the Americans. The U.S. had gained air superiority not just through the development of better planes, but also through better use of technology and strategic planning. American radar systems allowed their fighters to detect incoming Japanese planes before the Zeros could close in for an attack. This gave American pilots an incredible advantage, allowing them to surprise and ambush Japanese forces before they could even react. The Japanese, by contrast, had been relying on outdated tactics and equipment, which made it increasingly difficult for them to respond effectively to the new American tactics. With fewer resources and a lack of effective replacements for their aging aircraft, the Japanese Air Force was on the defensive. This imbalance was painfully evident in the skies over the Philippines, where American fighters not only outperformed their Japanese counterparts, but did so with greater coordination and effectiveness. The tactical superiority of the American Air Forces in the Philippines was a significant turning point in the war, signaling the shift from Japanese air dominance to American supremacy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which followed shortly after these aerial engagements, would become the largest naval battle in history. But by that time, the Japanese had already lost control of the skies, making their naval operations increasingly futile. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 had long been the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy. When it first appeared in combat in 1940, it was revolutionary. Lightweight, fast, and maneuverable, it was a formidable weapon that could easily outpace most enemy fighters of the time. The Zero's success in the early battles of the Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to the Battle of the Coral Sea, solidified its reputation as one of the most lethal fighters of the early war years. But as the war progressed and new technologies emerged, the Zeros began to show their limitations. By 1944, the once unstoppable Zero was facing growing obsolescence. The primary reason for the decline in its effectiveness was its vulnerability to newer, more advanced American aircraft. While the Zero's agility remained impressive, its lack of armor and its relatively weak armament made it increasingly prone to being shot down by the more durable and heavily armed American fighters, such as the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. The Zero was also aging. By 1944, The Japanese were struggling to keep up with the demand for high-quality aircraft and experienced pilots. The Japanese military, which had once had a vast industrial base for building and maintaining their aircraft, found itself under strain from constant Allied bombing raids and a lack of critical resources such as raw materials and fuel. This resulted in aircraft production that was often rushed, leading to poor manufacturing quality and less reliable planes. Meanwhile, the American aircraft were continually improved. The F-6F Hellcat, for example, was designed specifically to be a better adversary to the Zero. It had a greater wingspan, making it more stable in high-speed maneuvers, and its engines were more powerful, allowing it to outpace the Zero in many aerial engagements. Additionally, the Hellcat's armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it more resistant to damage. The American forces had perfected the art of coordinated group tactics, ensuring that their pilots were not fighting alone and that they could support one another in combat situations. This technological shift marked the decline of the Zero as the dominant force in the skies. While the Zero remained a deadly opponent in the hands of skilled pilots, it was no longer the clear-cut winner in dogfights. The Japanese were also slow to develop a replacement for the Zero, with the later models like the Ki-84 Hayate and the J-2M Raiden failing to provide the same level of performance and numbers as the American F-Series aircraft. The Zero, once the hallmark of Japan's naval air strength, was now being outclassed, proving that technological superiority in warfare was key to maintaining air dominance. The failure of the Japanese leadership to adapt to the changing realities of air warfare was another critical factor in the decline of the Zero. From the early stages of the war, Japanese military leadership had shown incredible strategic and tactical ingenuity. But as the war progressed, their ability to innovate and respond to Allied advancements began to falter. One of the key aspects of Japan's initial success in the Pacific was their ability to outmaneuver and surprise the Allies. Japanese pilots, trained in the art of aerial dogfighting, were able to exploit the weaknesses of early Allied aircraft, using speed and maneuverability to gain the upper hand. However, by 1944, the Allies had adapted, and their new aircraft were not only faster, but more powerful and well-armored than anything the Japanese could field. The Zeros, despite their remarkable agility, could no longer keep up with the pace of technological development in American aviation. Japanese leadership also failed to adequately address the logistical problems that plagued their air force. As American air raids on Japan's industrial centers increased, the supply of critical materials for aircraft production dwindled. The Japanese military, despite their initial successes, were now under-resourced and increasingly unable to replenish their aircraft fleet at the same rate as the Allies. Moreover, the Japanese strategy relied heavily on individual heroics from their pilots, often disregarding the importance of air superiority gained through technological advancements and coordinated tactics. 3. Lack of effective leadership in terms of adapting to the changing conditions of the war resulted in the gradual erosion of Japan's ability to defend itself in the skies. The Japanese command did not recognize early enough that technological advancements in American aircraft, coupled with superior air strategies, would make the Zero obsolete. The failure to develop a new generation of fighters and the reluctance to adapt to the realities of modern air combat sealed the fate of Japan's air forces in the latter years of the war. October 25, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was already underway, and the skies above the Philippines were teeming with aircraft from both the U.S. and Japanese forces. The Japanese had sent everything they had to stop the American invasion of the Philippines, which was seen as a critical step in halting the Allied advance toward Japan. In the air, the Japanese had sent their remaining aircraft, including their prized Zeros, to engage the American air fleet. For the Japanese pilots, this battle was crucial, possibly their last chance to turn the tide of the war. They took to the skies with the full knowledge that their nation's survival was at stake. They were not just fighting to protect the Philippines, they were fighting for the very future of the Japanese Empire. The American aircraft were closing in, and the battle for air superiority had begun. But as the first waves of Japanese Zeros and American fighters collided in the skies over Leyte Gulf, a harsh reality set in for the Japanese pilots. Their Zeros could no longer match the speed, firepower, and durability of the American fighters. What had once been the most advanced and feared aircraft in the world was now struggling to keep up with the new generation of American planes. The Japanese pilots, skilled as they were, began to realize that the superiority of their Zeros was no longer enough to win the battle. The American planes, most notably the F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, were faster, more heavily armed, and more maneuverable than the Zeros. These American fighters had been built with the express purpose of countering the Zeros' advantages. The Hellcats, with their powerful engines and robust design, could take more damage and keep flying. The Corsairs, with their superior range and firepower, proved deadly in both dogfights and long-range missions. For the Japanese pilots, this was an awakening. No longer were they able to outmaneuver the enemy with their agility. Now, they were outgunned and outclassed. The turning point came when a group of American Hellcats engaged a squadron of Zeros. Despite the Zeros' legendary agility, they were overwhelmed by the American planes' superior range, firepower, and tactical coordination. The American pilots, armed with better training and experience, used their planes' advantages to their full effect. The Zeros, unable to close the gap in terms of performance, were rapidly shot down. The skies over Leyte Gulf, once dominated by Japanese aircraft, were now firmly in the hands of the American pilots. The shock was not just tactical, but psychological. Japanese pilots who had once dominated the skies felt the weight of their machine's failure. They had long been told that the Zero was the ultimate fighter, but now it was clear that their machines, once symbols of the might of the Japanese Empire, were no longer equal to the challenge posed by the Allies. The fight for control of the air was lost. As the battle progressed, the Japanese forces found themselves increasingly unable to keep up with the American onslaught. The American fighters were relentless, and the Zeros, despite their bravery and the skill of the pilots, were being destroyed in greater numbers. The turning point had been reached. The Zeros, though formidable in their prime, could no longer match the American fighters that had evolved to dominate the skies. This moment, when the Zeros faltered, was not just a tactical defeat, it was the collapse of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. The realization that their once proud aircraft could not hold their ground against the Americans signaled the end of an era. The battle for the skies over the Philippines was, in many ways, the final chapter in the story of the Zero's dominance. As the American planes continued to tear through the Japanese defenses, the Japanese pilots understood that they were fighting a losing battle, not just against the American aircraft, but against the changing nature of warfare itself. As the last Zeros fell from the sky, their pilots, once confident in their superiority, were left grappling with a harsh reality. The myth of the Zero, the aircraft that had been their pride and symbol of Japan's military strength, had been shattered. What had once been a force that could strike fear into the hearts of their enemies was now struggling to keep pace with the advancements in American aviation. The pilots who had once relied on their planes' speed and agility were now realizing that these advantages had been rendered obsolete by American technological and tactical superiority. For the Japanese command, the sight of their aerial forces being systematically destroyed was a devastating blow. They had always viewed air superiority as crucial to their war strategy. The loss of so many skilled pilots and the dwindling numbers of operational Zeros meant that the Japanese Air Force could no longer provide the same level of resistance that had defined their early victories. The Japanese leadership had failed to anticipate the rapid development of American aviation, which had rendered the Zeros and their tactics ineffective in the face of newer, more advanced aircraft. As the American planes continued their relentless assault, the Japanese leadership realized that their ability to defend their airspace was slipping away. The battle for the Philippines was not just a loss of territory, but the collapse of Japan's last line of defense. With their air forces broken and their naval power waning, the Japanese military was left to confront the bitter truth. They could no longer keep up with the rapidly advancing American forces. The turning point had not only shifted the balance of power in the skies, but had also foreshadowed the inevitable collapse of Japan's war effort. In the coming months, the Allies would continue their relentless push toward Japan's home islands, with air superiority no longer in question. The American planes, now equipped with greater firepower, better durability, and superior tactics, would dominate the remaining battles of the Pacific War. For the Japanese pilots, this shift marked the end of an era. They had fought valiantly, but the overwhelming technological advances of the Americans had left them unable to keep up. The pilots, many of whom had been trained in the early days of the war and had lived through the glories of Japan's early successes, now faced the realization that their once dominant position in the skies had been irrevocably lost. In the final battles of the Pacific, it was clear that the Zeros, once symbols of Japan's military might, were no longer the force to be reckoned with. For the American pilots, the turning point brought a sense of vindication. The battle in the skies over Leyte and the Philippines was not just a military victory. It was a moment of triumph over the once feared Japanese air superiority. The American fighters, having faced years of defeat and setbacks, had now proven their supremacy. The Hellcats and Corsairs, while not as agile as the Zero, had shown that their strength lay in their firepower, resilience, and the coordination of tactics that had become the hallmark of American air combat. The Zero's failure to keep up with the American aircraft was symbolic of the broader technological and strategic shifts that were occurring in the war. The American ability to adapt quickly, build better aircraft, and utilize new tactics had overwhelmed the Japanese forces, who had been slow to recognize the changing dynamics of aerial warfare. The turning point in the Philippines was not just the defeat of the Zeros, but the collapse of a strategy that had relied on outdated methods in the face of an evolving and increasingly sophisticated enemy. As the battle for the skies reached its final stages, the Japanese pilots and their commanders had no choice but to accept the inevitable. The air superiority they had once enjoyed was now a thing of the past. The failure of the Zeros in combat was a powerful reminder of the need for constant adaptation in the face of new technological advancements. The battle for air superiority over the Philippines marked the end of Japan's dominance in the skies and set the stage for the final push to bring an end to the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, though primarily a naval conflict, marked a pivotal moment not only for naval dominance, but for air superiority as well. For Japan, the aftermath was catastrophic. Their aerial forces, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now in disarray. The loss of so many skilled pilots and aircraft was a blow from which Japan's Air Force would never recover. The skies over the Philippines, once dominated by Japanese Zeros, were now firmly under American control, and this marked the beginning of the end for Japan's ability to defend its remaining territories. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the Japanese Air Force begin to crumble. With the loss of so many aircraft and experienced pilots, Japan's ability to field effective defensive air operations was severely diminished. The Zeros, once revered as the most advanced fighter in the world, were no longer capable of meeting the demands of modern warfare. The aging aircraft, outclassed by newer and more powerful American fighters, had no chance against the overwhelming firepower of the Allied planes. For the Japanese military leadership, the collapse of their air forces in the Philippines was a devastating blow. The Imperial Navy's failure to protect the skies over their remaining islands meant that the Allied forces could now strike at will, unopposed. The loss of air superiority had dire consequences for Japan's defense strategy, leaving them vulnerable to the advancing American forces. The loss of the Philippine Islands was not just a military defeat. It was a strategic disaster that left Japan's southern perimeter exposed and opened the door for the final Allied push toward the Japanese home islands. In the aftermath of the battle, Japan's ability to mount any sort of meaningful counterattack was severely crippled. The once feared Japanese Air Force had been overwhelmed by a combination of American technological superiority and tactical mastery. The Zeros, which had been the symbol of Japanese aviation prowess, were now relegated to the status of relics, ineffective against the new generation of American fighters that dominated the skies. For the American forces, the victory was significant not just for the tactical and strategic advantage it provided, but also for the morale boost it gave to the Allied troops. After years of hard-fought battles and setbacks in the Pacific, the success over the Zeros and the Japanese air forces signaled the shift in the war. It was clear now that the Allies had the upper hand. The destruction of the Japanese Air Force in the Philippines opened the door for American bombers to strike deep into Japanese territory, unopposed by effective aerial defenses. For the American pilots, the aftermath of the battle was one of vindication. The Hellcats and Corsairs had proven their worth in the heat of battle. American pilots, who had spent years fighting to overcome the Japanese air superiority, now found themselves in a position of dominance. The Hellcat, with its resilience and firepower, and the Corsair, with its speed and range, had proven to be the superior machines, capable of outmaneuvering and outgunning the Zeros. The victory was a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of American engineering, tactics, and training. But the victory in the skies did not come without cost. The American pilots had lost comrades, and the battle had taken its toll on both sides. The airmen who had fought in the skies over Leyte knew that the Japanese, though defeated, were not yet done. The war was far from over, but the battle for the skies over the Philippines was a decisive turning point. In Japan, the aftermath of the battle was one of deep disillusionment. The Zeros, once symbols of national pride, were now obsolete. For the pilots who had flown them, the realization that their once dominant machines were no longer effective was a bitter pill to swallow. Many of the surviving pilots who had once been heroes found themselves without a place in the New World Order. The failure of the Zeros, combined with the steady retreat of Japanese forces, signaled that the war was nearing its end. Japan, once a formidable force in the Pacific, now faced the grim reality that they were losing. The psychological toll of the battle was felt not only by the Japanese pilots, but by the civilian population as well. The Japanese leadership, having staked their future on the defense of the Pacific, was now forced to come to terms with the fact that they could no longer hold back the tide of Allied progress. With the loss of air superiority and the advancing American forces, Japan's ability to continue the war had been severely diminished. In the wake of the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the dramatic loss of air superiority over the Philippines, Japan's position in the war became increasingly untenable. The failure to defend their skies marked a tipping point in the Pacific War, and the cascading effects of this defeat would reverberate throughout the Japanese war effort in the final months of the conflict. For the Japanese military, the consequences of the loss were both immediate and long-term. With their air forces in disarray and their aircraft rendered obsolete by superior American fighters, Japan's ability to mount an effective defense against the Allies had been fundamentally weakened. The once proud Zero, which had been the crown jewel of Japan's aerial power, was no longer able to keep up with the faster, more durable American planes. The Japanese pilots, though still highly skilled, were now outclassed in nearly every engagement. As the war progressed, Japan's remaining air assets were stretched thin. The loss of experienced pilots, many of whom had been shot down in the skies over the Philippines, meant that the Japanese could not replace their casualties at a sufficient rate. In contrast, the Americans were able to replenish their ranks of pilots and aircraft with relative ease, making it clear that Japan was fighting a losing battle. The Japanese leadership, already dealing with mounting resource shortages and constant Allied bombing raids, could not stem the tide of American air superiority. The collapse of Japanese air strength in the Philippines was followed by a series of losses in other theaters of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, which had once been the dominant force in the Pacific, was now severely weakened. The loss of key battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines, combined with the destruction of their air forces, left Japan's navy in no position to contest the Allies' naval superiority. The Japanese High Command was now in full retreat, unable to offer any meaningful resistance to the advancing American forces. For the United States, the aftermath of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a major strategic victory. The defeat of Japan's air forces opened the door for further American advances in the Pacific. With the skies now clear, American bombers and fighters could strike Japanese positions with impunity. The way was paved for the liberation of the Philippines, and, from there, the American forces would continue their march toward Japan's home islands. In the months that followed, the U.S. military capitalized on its newfound air superiority. American bombers, including the B-29 Superfortress, began relentless bombing campaigns over Japan, targeting industrial centers, transportation hubs, and military installations. With the Zeros no longer able to intercept these bombers, Japan's infrastructure was systematically destroyed. The country's ability to continue fighting was further eroded as the bombings took a heavy toll on both its economy and civilian morale. The final blow to Japan's air defense came in the form of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombings, coupled with the devastation caused by relentless air raids and the failure of the Japanese Air Force to prevent them, hastened Japan's surrender. Japan's leadership, already faced with the collapse of its military defenses, could no longer ignore the inevitability of defeat. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, officially bringing an end to World War II. The Japanese military's inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of aerial warfare, highlighted by the decline of the Zero, was a key factor in Japan's defeat. The Japanese leadership had been slow to recognize the superiority of American aircraft, and their failure to develop new, more effective planes and strategies doomed their efforts. In the end, it wasn't just superior numbers or better tactics that led to the collapse of Japan's air forces. It was the ability of the Americans to innovate, to adapt, and to continually outclass the Japanese in every aspect of aerial combat. For the American pilots who had fought in the skies over the Philippines, the aftermath of the battle was one of triumph. The Hellcats and Corsairs had proven themselves in combat, decisively demonstrating that American technological advancements had surpassed those of the Japanese. The American forces, with their superior aircraft, coordination, and ability to adapt, had achieved air superiority and had set the stage for the final victory in the Pacific. In Japan, the psychological impact of the defeat was profound. The loss of the Zeros, once seen as the pinnacle of Japanese aviation, was a bitter blow to national pride. The pilots who had once flown the Zero, hailed as heroes, now found themselves part of a broken military that could no longer defend its skies. The defeat in the Philippines marked not just a tactical loss, but a turning point in the broader strategic collapse of the Japanese war effort. The inevitable surrender was now only a matter of time. The Battle of the Philippines, particularly the stunning failure of the Japanese Zero to compete with American fighters, marked a profound turning point, not only in the Pacific War, but in the history of modern aerial combat. The Japanese Zero, once the epitome of air superiority and a symbol of Japanese military might, was ultimately rendered obsolete in the face of American innovation, superior tactics, and technological advancements. This moment, though seemingly just a single episode in a larger conflict, signified the end of an era of Japanese aviation dominance and heralded a new chapter in the art of war, where technological innovation and adaptability would determine the outcome of battles. For the American pilots, the battle over the skies of the Philippines was more than a victory. It was the culmination of years of struggle, adaptation, and learning from past defeats. The Hellcats and Corsairs, with their superior speed, durability, and firepower, had proven themselves the superior machines. But beyond the technological edge, it was the American pilots' ability to adapt and evolve their tactics that ultimately turned the tide. The once feared Japanese Zeros, despite their legendary maneuverability, were no longer a match for the firepower and strategic precision of their American counterparts. In the air, the U.S. had definitively wrested control from Japan, a shift that would have profound implications for the remainder of the war. For Japan, the aftermath of the battle was both tactical and psychological. The loss of the Zero as the dominant air fighter was symbolic of the broader failure to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Japan's leadership had clung to outdated strategies and technologies, relying on the same methods that had once led to early victories in the war. The Americans, by contrast, had quickly realized the importance of technological advancement, coordination, and strategic innovation. The Japanese military's failure to do the same sealed their fate. The loss of air superiority over the Philippines was the first in a series of crushing blows that would ultimately lead to Japan's surrender, the destruction of the Zeros, and the collapse of Japan's air defense were not merely military defeats. They were psychological blows that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The pilots who had flown these legendary aircraft, once the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy, were now facing the reality that their aircraft were no longer capable of defending their nation. The realization that the aircraft they had once relied upon had been outclassed was a harsh reckoning for the Japanese pilots and their commanders alike. But in the broader scope of history, the end of the Zero's dominance was also a reminder of the relentless march of technological progress. The lessons learned from the Pacific air battles, particularly over the Philippines, would go on to shape future military strategies and aviation technology. The advent of more powerful, versatile fighters and the shift towards coordinated, group-based tactics would lay the foundation for air combat for generations to come. The Battle of the Philippines was more than just a military victory. It was a defining moment that revealed the essential nature of adaptation in warfare. While Japan's Zeros were outclassed, the American planes' victory was not only due to superior technology, but the ability to evolve tactics in real time. It was a reminder that in warfare, as in all things, the ability to change and adapt is often the key to survival. The failure of the Zeros was a reminder that even the most advanced technologies can be surpassed, and that innovation, when matched with skill and resilience, can shift the balance of power in an instant. For both the American soldiers and the Japanese pilots, the sky was no longer the arena of unchecked power. The loss of the Zeros in the Philippine skies marked the beginning of the end of Japan's military dominance in the Pacific. But it also showed that the future of warfare would be defined not just by the weapons used, but by the minds behind them. The battle above the Philippines was a turning point that not only decided the fate of the Pacific, but changed the course of history in a way that would resonate far beyond the war.